Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about the structure of our nervous system and the cells, the specialized cells that make up the nervous system. All right. If you notice that the chapter is going out of order, and I'm starting with part 2, unit C first, is because I want to kind of reorder how you learn these, learning the structural parts first, and then we'll go back and see how they function a little bit more detailed later on. Today we're looking at neurons and neurotransmitters. Neurons are a specialized type of cell that have a very specific structure. There are three types of neurons that our bodies have. There are sensory neurons, uh, interneurons, or also known as relay neurons, and motor neurons. Each is structured mostly the same way with things in slightly different order. And the reason why they're in different order or arrangement of physical structure is they each have a separate purpose. Sensory neurons do a different job than motor neurons, which do a different job than relay or interneurons. Right? So sensory neurons are what we use for our senses, sense of touch, taste, smell, textures, things like that, right? Every temperature. They are specialized cells. They're designed to take information from our skin and pass it through our body into our brain so that our brain can interpret what that is. So if you ever put your hand on a warm plate, your registers as warm, right? Your hand doesn't know that it's warm until your brain recognizes the connection and says, oh, I remember that sensation. That is warmth. That is heat. Is it in a safe amount? Yes or no? And it's going to very quickly decide if you need to whip your hand away to avoid getting burnt. Okay, so sensory neurons take information from the outside of the body and from our senses, right? Sight, sound, touch, taste, right? All of those are senses, and specialized neurons in those different organs of our body take the information from the outside world and move it into our brain where it is processed. Motor neurons, also known as efferent neurons, are the parts that control the muscles, right? So, motor, like the motor of a car makes a car go, our motor neurons make our muscles move. When I'm clenching my hand or moving my fingers around, right? My brain is consciously telling me, tap the fingers together, right? Do this, right? I consciously do that. Sometimes motor neurons respond on their own. We call that a reflex. We'll talk more about that when we get into the other parts of the nervous system. And connecting the sensory neurons and the motor neurons to the brain and making sure that the signals getting transmitted properly are what we call interneurons or relay neurons. Okay, these are extremely long, right? So, for example, the neurons that are located, the nerves located in your spinal cord, are long interneurons, right? They connect to the motor neurons, they connect to the sensory neurons, and they are the ones that bring the information to the brain where it's processed and information from the brain back out to the extremities. Now, each neuron stores within it a stored amount of energy, what we call the resting potential. Okay, the resting potential is all of the energy that is stored in the cells and is waiting to be released. What triggers the release is when a signal reaches what is called a threshold level. The threshold level is something that triggers a response. So, using the example of sensory neurons, putting your hand on a hot plate, if your brain determines that that plate is too hot, right, it's going to potentially burn you, an automatic reflex kicks in to protect you that it triggers the threshold and causes the motor neurons in your hand to fire, pulling your hand away without even consciously thinking about it. Okay. The threshold is the kind of the last straw, the thing that tips it over and makes it actually function. Okay. Each neuron has what is stored in it, what's called the action potential. This is the energy that is stored that when it is fired, right, when the threshold is reached, it then releases its energy and sends it through the neuron from the head of the neuron to the tail of the neuron and triggers the next neuron in sequence. We'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment. All right. In your assignment, one of the things I'm asking you to do is to identify the different structures of a nerve cell, what we call a neuron. Okay. If you look at your graphic that I gave you, it has the different structures here. When I'm done with the lecture, go back and fill in those pieces using this graph to help you. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of the nerves. So the cell body is known as the soma, right? This is the head of the nerve, of the neuron, right? Think of the neuron. You've all taken biology at some point or science where you understand the structure of cells. The soma is the cell body, right? It's the white part on the diagram. It's the part that surrounds the nucleus and keeps it safe and sheltered. Okay, it's where the different structures hook onto for a cell. Within the center of the neuron is what we call the nucleus. This is the power center. This is where all of the action potential is stored. It's where the nutrients feed the cell and keep the cell functioning. It's where all the data that the cell needs to operate is stored. Think of it like the CPU on a computer, right? The computer processing unit, right? The dendrites are those little finger things that are sticking off the side of the cell, right? They reach out and we call them dendrites because they kind of look like tree branches. Dendris is what trees are called in Latin. And dendrites are designed to reach out like little fingers and sense the energy around them. Okay, so their job is to take in information that is coming in and determine what to do with it, right? So think of it as like a bunch of little fingers out there touching everything around them. Okay, and they take the signals from other neurons and decide, do we need to pass the message on, or do we stop the message here? Surrounding the main shaft of the neuron is what we call the myelin sheath. It is the part that is purple in the diagram in front of you. Okay, and this is a fatty tissue that works kind of like an insulator, right? If you've ever seen in cold weather, people will wrap their pipes in foam or some sort of heavy tape to try to keep them from freezing. The myelin sheath works like that. It is a fatty tissue that surrounds the cell, the tail of the cell, what we call the axon, and protects it. It also serves to move electricity through it. Think of it as an insulator, right? And the idea is that as the signals come in from one cell, one neuron to the dendrites of the next neuron, the nucleus looks at the information and says, yes, we need to keep passing this on, and fires, sending a signal down the axon. The myelin sheath, think of it kind of like crimping a hose, right? It can close off and stop the signal from going, or it can open up and let the flow continue through. Okay, the axon is the tail of the nerve. It is the neuron. It is the part that the signal runs along. Think of it like fiber optic cable passing the signal through. The better the connection, the faster the information is processed, right? And this is an important thing to note because based on a person's health, their neurons may fire better than if they are unhealthy. All right, and so the axon carries the signal from the head of the neuron to the tail of the neuron, right, which is what we call the terminus or the terminal branches. Okay, the axon terminal button or axon terminal branch, they call them different things, is where the signal is sent out. And think of it as kind of like generating a spark. It sends the signal to the next cell over, right? It's a little tricky to think about, but think of a nerve as starting at the head, sending a signal all the way through the tail, jumping to the next head, and moving on, right? And each cell, each neuron has to decide, does the information coming in from the previous neuron give me enough reason to pass the message on, or am I going to stop the message here? So think of neurons as on or off. They're binary. They're either turning on and meet the threshold and send the signal and release their action potential, or they decide that it does not meet the criteria, does not meet the threshold, we're going to stop and not send the signal any further. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about the main structures of the brain. This is the parts of the brain that you are responsible for knowing on the left side. Okay, I'm not going to necessarily make you learn all the smaller parts that are on the right side, but you will need to know the different major portions of the brain, right? What we call the four lobes of the brain. So we have the frontal lobe, right? Frontal lobe right here in the front. Okay. Behind that, we have the parietal lobe, which is on the top of your head towards the back. So if you have kind of the crown of your head, the little spot in the back, just at the top in the back of your head, that is the parietal lobe. Behind that is the occipital lobe, so on the back of the neck. And then you have the temporal lobe that are on the sides. Now, the different structures of the brains each have different function, and we will talk about those in a future lecture, but I want to make sure that you, for now, know where the general anatomy is, right? So the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, right? Make sure that you practice those and know them. They are something I will hold you accountable for. Inside the brain structures you see on the right is made up of different parts. And we will look at these different parts. I may or may not necessarily require you to know all of them, but you definitely will need to know the four lobes of the brain. That is something I am holding you accountable for. But we will be talking about these other parts of the brain, and it is good for you to be familiar with them. All right, so going back to neurotransmitters. So we have here is an example of the terminus branch. Let me go back to the image here, to the terminus branch. So this is what we're looking at here, this last little bit of a neuron. Okay, and what this does, so this is the terminus branch of one neuron. This is the dendrite of the next neuron. So again, going back to our thing. So this is the terminus branch. This is the dendrite, terminus branch. Oop, didn't mean to do that. Terminus branch, dendrite of the next cell. Okay, so when a neuron releases its action potential, that's the energy that is stored in it, it is going to send an electrical pulse. That pulse moves through the head of the neuron, through the body, through the axon, traveling along those cables, the axon, and it is kind of pumped up or amped up by the myelin sheath. It gives it more strength to push it to the next one. When it reaches the terminus, right, the terminal branch or the terminal button, it then is going to release what are known as neurotransmitters. Now, if you look at the diagram here, neurotransmitters are various types of chemical signals. Think of them as chemical keys, if you will, that are specialized, right? So this chemical key is going to be different than this one, which will be different than this one. You can see they're all arranged differently, right? And what they do is your body tells your neuron says we need to release this chemical. Some of the chemicals will excite the body and increase the speed at which things function. Others will slow it down. We'll address that in another discussion. Okay, but the terminus releases these neurotransmitters, and each key fits in a specific lock in the dendrite of the neighboring cell. So some dendrites can only receive this type of neurotransmitter. Others can only receive this kind of neurotransmitter. So depending on the chemical makeup, different signals or switches are turned on. All right. The neurons themselves release their neurotransmitters across a gap between the end of one neuron and the head of another neuron, right? We call this the synaptic gap. This is synaptic gap. Synaptic gap. It jumps across. So the neurotransmitters are kicked loose. They move across the gap into the next neuron, and that neuron either absorbs them and says, yes, we're now turning on the switches, or nope, we're not going to do it, and shutting them off. Okay. After the one cell finishes firing all its neurotransmitters, it then begins to reabsorb the neurotransmitters that it sent out. So as soon as it's done its job, the neuron releases the neurotransmitters that it took in its dendrite and reabsorbs the ones through its terminus or terminal bulbs so that it's ready to go again. So it's kind of like it's breathing. Takes in the neurotransmitter, then releases it, and then it reabsorbs the neurotransmitters that it previously released into the next cell. Okay. So they call this process uptake so that we can use it again. The neurotransmitter is used again over and over again. Sometimes, however, the neurotransmitters are destroyed in the process. This usually occurs through drugs or alcohol, high levels of stress, health conditions, or brain damage, like through an accident. So, neurotransmitters are what help us regulate our hormones and regulate our moods. So, if a person, for example, suffers from chronic depression, they may have a shortage of specific neurotransmitters. It could be they don't stay alive and those neurotransmitters die. Could be that your body doesn't produce enough of them, or it could be that your body has trouble reabsorbing them, and so you're constantly running out of them. There's lots of reasons for this. We'll go into details on those at a much later time when we look at mood and mood disorders and so on. Right now, our focus is on the anatomy. Okay, neurotransmitters come in two forms, right? Some neurotransmitters are designed to excite the body, right? Make the body feel alive and charge it up and pump the muscles up, right? We call these excitatory neurotransmitters. Okay, and what they do is they encourage the next neuron to fire. So they pump up the energy, they increase the threshold. It's like turning up the dial, the volume dial on a radio, right? That keeps it really low, it's still going to play the music, but if you turn it up, it's really going to intensify the sound. That's what excitatory neurons do, or neurotransmitters do, is they excite the body. They encourage it to go faster, stronger, louder. Inhibitory neurotransmitters, on the other hand, do the opposite. Their job is to slow things down, to let the thing come to rest, right? We don't need to be excited. It's okay. We're just going to relax. It's all right. And they will slow down the system. Ultimately, what our body wants is to reach a state of balance, what we call homeostasis. So if we're too tired, our brain might produce and cause our body to release more neurotransmitters to wake us up, right? Something exciting happening. Let's get excited. Okay. When that excitement is over, our brain and body release other neurotransmitters to slow it down. Say, okay, catch your breath, easy. We're okay. We're safe. We don't have to worry about it, right? And it wants to find balance where you're not super excited and not sitting on the couch like a lump, right? They want something in between. So we function on everyday life. People who have chronic depression often either have a shortage of the excitatory neurotransmitters or have too many of the inhibitory neurotransmitters, right? And it's different types of depression. That's why for people who are on antidepressants, there are different kinds. Some are designed to stimulate the body and produce more or mimic neurotransmitters to make you feel more excited and more alive. Others are designed to combat or slow down the production of these inhibitory ones, the ones that want to slow you down, right? So it's very complex, a lot of advanced anatomy on that. For your purposes, you just need to know that the body wants homeostasis, it wants balance. In order to achieve balance, the neurons will sometimes release excitatory neurotransmitters to increase the body's response, or inhibitory to slow it down. Right? These are some important neurotransmitters that I do want you to know. I will be giving them to you as part of your vocabulary next week. You won't have to worry about them today, but you will have to worry about them in the future. Okay, and so what I want you to be able to do is to identify the purpose. What is it that these neurotransmitters do for the body? Okay, Um, Other types of chemicals that we're looking at, well, let's go back to these here. So ACH is what activates the muscles and makes our body move. It's the neurochemical that moves in motor neurons to cause our arms to, um, our hands to squeeze when we grab something, our arms to tighten up and brace when we're going to lift something heavy. Serotonin is something that our brains produce naturally, but for some people, they don't produce enough serotonin. And so, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's extremely important because it regulates our mood, our emotions, and our appetite. People who have chronic depression often have trouble with production of serotonin. Okay, it's one of those chemicals that, for whatever reason, whether it's stress that causes it, um, birth problems with our genetics, uh, disease, whatever. It's a biological reason for depression. Dopamine is the part that gets our brain really excited, right? It's when dopamine's going, like if you're at a concert and you hear your favorite band playing and your heart's beating really hard and you're like so excited you can't sit still, your body is being pumped full of dopamine. This triggers the pleasure center of the brain, right? This is what causes you to get super excited and have the best day of your life, right? People who do drugs and become addicted to drugs often do so because they have low levels of dopamine. And so by taking these drugs, they stimulate or simulate dopamine, which makes them feel good. The problem is that when people do drugs, it the drugs kills the body's ability to naturally produce these things, which is why people who start out on drugs have to take more and more and more to get the same effect. Another neurotransmitter you need to know, epinephrine. Okay, we also call this adrenaline. This is what causes your body to automatically respond in fight, flight, or freeze. Right? So if you've ever been startled and suddenly your heart's beating really fast, that's because your body's released epinephrine, right? Or adrenaline. Okay. The opposite of epinephrine is what we call norepinephrine. This is the part that is supposed to um, this works like epinephrine is that it speeds up the body, but where epinephrine speeds up the body to cause us to act quickly, norepinephrine is what we would consider causing stress, right? That sense I can't get calm. There's no threat that I see, right? So I'm not having the physical response of epinephrine, but yet I can't shut my brain off. My brain's still running, right? There's stress or anxiety. If you've ever had a panic attack, your body's being flooded with norepinephrine. Okay, this causes anxiety. So if someone's paranoid or feeling like edgy, this is usually what it is. GABA is what calms the nervous system down. So after we have an epinephrine attack where our body's physically responding to some sort of threat, or a norepinephrine response, which is the physical response to stress, GABA is what calms us down. The way to improve GABA is through exercise, eating right, healthy meals, not junk food, and getting enough sleep. And our body will produce this hormone or neurotransmitter that will allow us to relax and slow down our nervous system. And then finally, there's glutamate, right? And this is a type of neurotransmitter that is used and is key to long term memory. What stimulates the growth of new long term memory is eating right, getting exercise, and getting enough sleep. Sleep is by far the most um, abused uh, stressor that we as humans have, especially here in America. Americans are highly stressed and we don't get enough sleep. And if we would all just sleep 8 to 10 hours a night, the world would calm down a lot. But because most people average about 6 hours of sleep a night, many teenagers less than that, it's no wonder we're always running around irritable. And then there are other neurotransmitters or other brain chemicals that affect our ability to do things. Neuropeptides help regulate the activity of other neurons. Think of them as the communication cells between neurons. They help the neurons understand whether or not they should fire or relax. Endorphins often relieve pain and stress in the body. This is from our pituitary gland, which is one of our hormonal systems that decreases swelling, right? It eases pain. So if you've ever stubbed your toe and then it stops hurting, right? And you get to the point where, like, well, I can't really feel my toe anymore. That's because your body has released endorphins to calm it down. That's why when you're super excited, those of you who play sports, for example, it's why when you're in the middle of a football game or a soccer match and you're going really hard and you run into somebody, you don't feel the impact. But then later on that night, you're sore and achy and you're like, ow, what happened? Oh, where'd that bruise come from? Right? Because your body released endorphins to mask the pain so that you can continue to function. And now when you've calmed down, now the pain returns and you start to feel it. Right? Um, And then finally, the last thing are what we call agonists and antagonists. These are chemicals, man made chemicals, artificial chemicals, that are designed to mimic or copy our natural neurotransmitters. Now, the great thing about these is when we do them to replace neurotransmitters that help us, for example, if someone does not produce enough dopamine to make them, or serotonin to make them feel good, then we can mimic it through artificial means, right? Like, for example, serotonin is when people have depression, some people don't produce enough serotonin. Prozac and other antidepressants mimic the structure of serotonin. And so artificially, we trick the body into thinking it is receiving the proper neurotransmitter. And so our mood is altered because of the chemical, right? Agonists activate receptors for neurotransmitters and makes the reception stronger, right? So if we, for example, are taking a drug like Prozac for depression, it simulates or mimics serotonin and causes our body to perceive that it has higher levels of serotonin than it thought. Okay. Antagonists, on the other hand, block the reception. So if you take a pain pill, for example, let's say you have surgery and the doctor gives you codeine for your wisdom teeth removal. What codeine does is it doesn't stop the pain by fixing the body. What it does is it mimics the um, neurotransmitters that block pain. So we call them antagonists. Agonists increase reception, antagonists block reception. All right, so these are the basic structures of a neurotransmitter and how they function, how a neuron is put together, and its purpose. That is it for today. Thank you, guys and gals.